He's just perfect, and now he's just immortal! Justify is the 13th Triple Crown winner! They're coming to the wire, and Accelerate wins the Breeders' Cup Classic for John Sadler!
The manufacturer of the raging debate over who should be the 2018 Horse of the Year between Accelerate and Triple Crown winner Justify. Now, Accelerate deserves a lot of credit. He won 5 Grade 1s, 4 at a mile and a quarter. He won 4 of his 5 Grade 1s out in California, and I'm not one of those purists that believes that West Coast racing is inherently inferior to East Coast racing, which for decades has carried the traditional championship races and is considered to be a stronger circuit. But we've seen those things start to really, those shifting tides emerge and surface. And so therefore, I think that, in the emergence of, trainers like Bob Baffert, multi-coastal, bi-coastal trainers like Wayne Lucas, who sort of set that trend, and in the subsequent years, Todd Pletcher and Chad Brown and many others, things have changed a little bit. And not to mention, there are a lot of really good races in other parts of the country as tracks have upgraded their purse structure and so forth. So, but this year was a year, like in quite a few years, where handicap horses, even though they're considered to be better, we have a lot of horses out there that are older that also are dealing with more infirmities, and the chances or the prospects of regression can be just as high, if not higher, than they are for young horses, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and so forth. So 2018 was a year in which the competition really came up a little bit weak, aided and abetted by the fact that Bob Baffert's West Coast, the 2017 3-year-old champion, went idle after the Dubai World Cup. Now, a lot of people, myself included, believe that West Coast presence against Accelerate in California may not have really changed the outcome, because if you really break down the numbers, clinically, he is not as good as some of Bob Baffert's best horses in the class, with the Point Givens and Silver Charm, and obviously Pharaoh and Justify. And then you can look at other horses like Looking at Lucky, General Challenge. I think that West Coast is a cut below that, and I think that subsequently he probably doesn't change the outcome of these races. But that's not really the strongest argument for those who are trying to poke holes in Accelerate's case that you can make. One of the biggest problems is that not only was the weakness of the competition, but how it's being framed as not being an issue versus Justify. Justify, a lot of people believe that he ran against a weak group of 3-year-olds, and that in the long term, in the overall picture, in the long-term situation, the 3-year-olds weren't very good. Well, there's no question about that. And there's no question in the Breeders' Cup Classic, they stunk up Churchill Downs, finishing 5th, 6th, 9th, 12th, 13th, and 14th, picking up the rear. And that would be Mendelssohn, Lone Sailor, Axelrod, McKenzie, Catholic Boy, and Europe's top 3-year-old Roaring Lion. So they did not run very, very well, juxtaposed against 3-year-old classes that have come in and not only won the Breeders' Cup Classic, but have dominated the top 4 spots, or at least 3 of the top 4 spots. That did not occur in 2018. It was something that I and a lot of people thought would happen, the breadth and the depth of this class. But for all of a sudden, now everybody's using the downward spiral of the 3-year-old division after Justify not only won the Triple Crown but was retired. And this is not, Justify's fault that these horses did not continue to improve. It's another reason why he dominated the Triple Crown. But what's interesting is that the fact that I'm getting to, and it takes, I've made a short story too long here, is that Accelerate faced these 3-year-olds, and for those who have made the argument that he beat the best horses in the Breeders' Cup Classic, this is something that is more fiction than fact. This is science, fiction has become science fact because of the fact that the Breeders' Cup Classic carries a lot of prestige. But it does not mean that it is unconditionally a race in which it's a better race than the Kentucky Derby and some of the other big grade ones. It's not always that way. The majority of the time it is, but not in 2018. But for those making the case for Accelerate, such as Matt Bernier and others, they have said that this race, proved that Accelerate, in beating these horses, had the best speed figures. He beat the best horses in the Breeders' Cup Classic, but this was not by any means the most sterling field in the Breeders' Cup, in the history of the Breeders' Cup World Thoroughbred Championships. And what's interesting is people are leaving out the fact these bad 3-year-olds that Justify beat, because everybody said, well, he didn't beat anything. Well, a lot of those nobodies were in that Breeders' Cup Classic. I find it interesting that people believe that when Accelerate beat those 3-year-olds, that he beat a quality field, including those 3-year-olds, that they were better on the first Saturday in November than they were on the first and third Saturday of May and the first Saturday of June, which is absolutely untrue. In actuality, the 3-year-olds, and I'm not one who's saying, I am not preaching to the bar that this was a great class of 3-year-olds in the end. But what's interesting is they actually were more competitive against Justify en route to his sweeping of the Triple Crown than they were when Accelerate hooked them in the Breeders' Cup Classic at Churchill Downs later in November. There's no question about that. Once again, let me repeat this in a language that everyone, some of you can try or will understand, and that is that they finished 5th, 6th, 9th, 12th, 13th, and 14th. Now, the top 6 finishers in the Kentucky Derby ran much better than those 3-year-olds did in the fall, and we all know that 3-year-olds are supposed to be improving. So if someone's going to make the argument that Accelerate not only beat top older horses, and there were some decent ones in there, but that he beat better 3-year-olds that were in better form, regardless of whether they faced Justify or not, that is another one of those science fictions that have become science fact, and that is not a fact. He won 4 grade 1s in 112 days. Accelerate won 5 grade 1s, and again, he beat 3-year-olds that I would agree weren't that great, but they were better on the first and third Saturday of May than they were on the first Saturday in June than they were on the first Saturday in November in that Breeders' Cup, where Accelerate faced 2 of Justify's opponents that he had beaten in the Triple Crown races in the Breeders' Cup Classic, along with 4 other 3-year-olds that apparently made no improvement. And that's what's been driving the narrative against Justify, that these 3-year-olds aren't good. He should not be penalized for the basically the ineptness of or the lackluster performances of his 3-year-old counterparts. Not to mention, Justify is like basically a defendant or a victim that is no longer with us, and people basically testifying in a bad or besmirching the memory of that particular individual, and you've got the person in basically what's an empty chair that can't testify and defend him or herself. And Justify is in the same position while he's over at Coolmore hanging out with American Pharaoh. He can't, basically answer these questions and defend himself against all of these, all of this incriminating evidence in which he really isn't to blame for, like I said, the lackluster performances of his 3-year-old counterparts. And people are lumping in what happened after the Triple Crown and piling that on to the whole narrative of that the 3-year-olds that Justify beat weren't that good. Well, of course they weren't that good overall. No one's arguing that based on the Breeders' Cup Classic. But they were better in the earlier part of the year than they were at the later part of the year, and that's when Accelerate ran against them. When by the time he got to them in November, they were worse than they were earlier in the year. So why is Accelerate, the quality of his Breeders' Cup, at a higher level just because the Breeders' Cup is considered to be a better race than what Justify did in the Triple Crown? Keep in mind, you don't get 2 or 3 chances if you stay in training as a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, which doesn't happen very often, but if you do, you get multiple opportunities if you're good enough to run in the Breeders' Cup Classic in the mile. You only get 1 shot in the Kentucky Derby, and Justify, as an unraced 2-year-old, took his shot, and he basically hit bullseye, and he won all 3 races. It is a very, very difficult thing to do, and if it wasn't, we'd have 30 or 40 Triple Crown winners, or we'd have double the Triple Crown winners that we have right now.
It is Accelerate. He's coming down to the 16th hole in front. They're coming to the wire, and Accelerate wins the Breeders' Cup Classic for John Sadler. He's just awesome. Justify has won the Kentucky Derby. For the first time in 136 years, a horse who did not race as a 2-year-old has won the Kentucky Derby.